four children of late Queen Elizabeth II gathered around her on Monday in a touching evening vigil inside St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. After a short procession, King Charles III led his sister Princess Anne and two brothers Prince Andrew and Prince Edward through the cathedral as they slowly walked in step with one another towards their positions. The king and his siblings each stood on one of the four corners of the oak coffin with their heads bowed in a ceremony known as the Vigil of the Princes. During the 10-minute vigil, the Duke of York closed his eyes for a time while the Princess Royal and the Earl of Wessex stared at the floor. As members of the public streamed by, the king, his eyes moistening, kept his hands linked and also stared towards the floor. The Queen's children joined for members of the Royal Company of Archers, who were standing guard dressed in long feathered hats and armed with arrows and quivers. They were the Queen's official bodyguards when in Scotland. Thousands of mourners who had been flowing past the casket all afternoon were temporarily stopped so that royals could take their places. Once the vigil began, though, people kept trickling by to get an extraordinary perspective of the historic event. To show their respect, many members of the public bowed to the king as they passed, while others walked somberly by with their heads bowed. In his lapel from Balmoral, Charles sported the Prince Charles Edward Stuart tartan and white heather, while Anne and Edward wore military garb. Andrew, however, wore merely a mourning suit despite having participated in the Falklands War. During a second vigil of the princes in Westminster Hall, the Duke of York will be allowed to appear in military garb. Silence filled the ancient building with just the public's footsteps making the only sound for most of it as they slowly filed past. Towards the end, a woman is heard saying, "We commend Her Majesty into the heart and hands of our God. May she rest in peace. God bless the Queen. God save the King." The vigil began at 7:46 p.m. and ended at 7:56 p.m. In the historic cathedral, with the Queen's daughters-in-law Camilla and Sophie Wessex seated on seats across from the coffin. The archers have been taking turns keeping guard at the coffin for 20 minutes while it remains at St Giles for 24 hours before it is moved to London to lie in state. The Vigil of the Princes tradition began in 1936 when the then King Edward VIII and his three brothers, Princes Albert, Henry and George, wore full military uniforms to stand guard at the coffin of their late father, King George V in Westminster Hall. The Princess Royal, who yesterday emotionally curtsied to her mother's oak coffin, was the first woman to take part in the traditional Vigil of the Princes. The King and Prince Andrew were pictured talking with one another after they left the cathedral. It followed poignant scenes earlier today when they walked behind their mother's coffin during a procession through Edinburgh. When Charles arrived at the cathedral, and as he departed, the members of the crowd cheered. As he drove past them, they took pictures and video and said, "Here he is. Here he is. It's the King." Charles waved at onlookers waiting at the barriers to see him. One woman was heard to say, "I missed him earlier and traveled up from Glasgow to see him. I waited 5 hours. I finally saw him." The Queen is expected to fly from Edinburgh Airport to RAF Nordholt in West London at 6 p.m. tomorrow, accompanied by Princess Anne. Her coffin will then travel by hearse to Buckingham Palace and a procession will take it to Westminster Hall on Wednesday. She will then lie in state there until 6:30 a.m. next Monday, the day of her funeral. Up to 1 million mourners are expected to file past and queues could be 12 hours long, stretching 3 miles.